Hello and welcome back to the Movie Memo Recaps. Today we are going to recap a 2010 movie titled 7 Days. Please be advised that there are spoilers ahead. In the opening scene we're introduced to Inspector Herba Copyright Mercure watching CCTV footage of a woman getting shot at a grocery store. Now we see Dr. Bruno Hamill operating at the hospital. Dr. Hamill has an 8-year-old daughter named Jasmine, and he is married to Sylvie, who works in an art gallery. Hamill is tired from the surgery, so he doesn't accompany Jasmine to her school. Jasmine heads off while Sylvie seduces Hamill. Later in the afternoon, Hamill wakes up and checks his emails. The doorbell rings, and it's a classmate of Jasmine who returns her notebooks and informs Hamill that Jasmine didn't come to school today. Later, Hamill informs Sylvie about Jasmine's disappearance, so they call the police. They inform the police about Jasmine's school route and her appearance for identification. Hamill goes with the cops to search for Jasmine. Unfortunately, they find Jasmine's dead body in the woods near a park. Not only was she slaughtered, but she was also assaulted. Hamill weeps over her corpse as the cops try to console him. A few days go by, and the Hamill house has become lifeless in Jasmine's absence. The couple is depressed and slowly becoming detached from each other. One day, Inspector Herba Copyright Mercure calls Hamill and informs him that they have identified Jasmine's killer by comparing his DNA to the sperm they found. The suspect is Anthony Lemaire, who had previously assaulted 3 little girls but got away due to a lack of evidence. Hamill watches Lemaire on the news as the police arrest him. Sylvie still cries even after knowing Lemaire might be sentenced for 15 to 25 years. Moments later, Hamill tells Sylvie that he's going to the hospital, but he lies. He drives in the forests and finds an old cottage that has not been used for a long time. He looks around the house and finds a shotgun in the cupboard. He moves things in the cottage and heads to a hardware store for supplies. He makes a deal with the handyman to keep his mouth shut. Afterwards, Hamill finds an apartment to rent in a suspicious neighborhood. At night, during dinner, Sylvie questions Hamill where he spent his day because she called the hospital and he wasn't there, but Hamill remains silent. Now he meets up with a junkie and pays him 10 grand to poison one of the policemen driving Lemaire to court. Back in the cottage, the handyman from the hardware store installs a torture device for Hamill. Hamill pays him and further offers to pay him 10 grand for every day if he doesn't tell anyone about this. The next day, the cops take Lemaire to court, but Hamill's junkie associate had done his work. Hamill follows the cops as their van loses control and crashes due to the driver passing out. He quickly approaches their van and offers his medical assistance. He takes the cop out of the van and then steals their van to kidnap Lemaire. Hamill takes the van to his secret spot and renders Lemaire unconscious with chloroform. Meanwhile, the cops find out that Hamill was behind kidnapping Lemaire. Hamill puts Lemaire in the trunk of his car and drives him to the secret cottage while the police visit Sylvie. Inspector Herba Copyright Mercure questions Sylvie if she knows where Hamill could have gone. He asks them if they have a cottage or any friend or relative's house. He could have gone, but Sylvie says no, they don't have any other place. Before leaving, the inspector informs Sylvie that they will tap her phone to trace calls in case Hamill calls her. Back in the cottage, Hamill hangs Lemaire with his hands tied. He then straps him to a stretcher and plans to torture him. Moments later, Lemaire wakes up and starts panicking. He asks Hamill why he kidnapped him, but Hamill remains silent and stares at him. Lemaire understands that he is Jasmine's father, so he starts begging, saying that he didn't do anything to Jasmine. He lies constantly, so Hamill smacks his knee with a sledgehammer. Lemaire screams in pain as Hamill sits down and drinks beer. On the other hand, Inspector Herba Copyright Mercure continues to watch the same footage, which is revealed to be of his late wife. Now, Hamill leaves Lemaire standing with his broken knee. He sits down and smiles as Lemaire screams in pain. It's day 2 now. Hamill pees on Lemaire and wakes him. Lemaire mentions that Hamill will be in prison for torturing him, but Hamill kicks his face. Hamill heads out and wanders by the lake. He notices a dead deer and brings its meat to feed Lemaire. Later, Hamill calls Sylvie and mentions that he smashed Lemaire's knee. Sylvie requests that he return home, but Hamill says he owes this vengeance to Jasmine. Inspector Herba Copyright cuts in and asks Hamill to turn himself in. Hamill agrees, but after 7 days, when it's Jasmine's birthday, he plans to execute Lemaire on the 7th day. Inspector Herba Copyright tries to empathize with Hamill, mentioning the death of his wife. Hamill asks if imprisoning his wife's killer made his life easier, but the inspector has no answer. After the call, Hamill scares Lemaire with a shotgun, but he doesn't shoot him. It is day 3 now. Hamill comes across the dead deer again after cutting it open, but this time, he covers it with tree branches. Meanwhile, at Inspector Herba Copyright's house, Herba Copyright drops his wedding ring, which rolls into his wife's room. He calls his assistant and asks her to retrieve it for him, because he doesn't have the courage to enter their bedroom. She also informs him that a salesman in a nearby town noticed Dr. Hamill buying an expensive laptop. The cops identify and question the junkie who aided Hamill. They also question a doctor from Hamill's hospital. He mentions seeing Hamill take some surgical instruments and antibiotics from the hospital. Lemaire now confesses that he put his hands on Jasmine, but it only infuriates Hamill, so he starts whipping Lemaire with a fat metal chain. Lemaire begs for mercy, but Hamill doesn't stop hitting him. Lemaire loses consciousness due to his brutal injuries, but that doesn't stop Hamill. The cops had failed to trace Hamill's call and are clueless now. It is day 4 now. Hamill notices Lemaire is having problems with his breathing and digestion. He heads out and notices the deer is decaying and starting to smell, so he drags it to a boat and drops it in the middle of the lake. Now, he watches the news where Sylvie gets interviewed and mentions Hamill has gone mad. Hamill later calls Sylvie furiously and asks why she called him crazy. She believes Hamill is doing all this out of guilt, but he blames her because she wanted to get intimate instead of taking Jasmine to school. They both get angry and smash their phones. Meanwhile, the cops successfully trace his call and plan to bust him. Hamill straps Lemaire to the stretcher again and shows him an antibiotic that paralyzes the body, but the person remains conscious. Lemaire mentions that he too was tortured in his childhood. That's why he needs help. Hamill ignores him and injects the antibiotic to cut out his small intestine. It's day 5 now. Hamill now cooks liquid food for Lemaire because he can't digest solid food anymore, but Lemaire refuses to accept his food. Hamill is now finding it hard to torture Lemaire, so he cries and punches the wall. He injects Lemaire with a glucose drip to keep him alive. Lemaire is now getting used to the torture, so he starts tormenting Hamill with his words. He mentions that he assaulted 3 other little girls, but he enjoyed Jasmine the most. Hamill loses control and starts choking him. He tries to end his life, but can't muster the strength. Hamill now calls Inspector Herva Copyright and asks him again if catching his wife's killer made his life easier. The inspector reveals that it didn't do anything. The cops now head to Hamill's location to arrest him, while Hamill informs the media about the 3 victims of Lemaire. The cops reach the decoy apartment that Hamill had rented in a shady neighborhood. They break in and find the place empty, with just a remote-controlled laptop connected to Hamill's phone that hides his actual location. Simultaneously, Hamill heads to a gas station to fill his car and buys beer. The cashier recognizes him and supports his actions. It's day 6 now. The cops are getting closer to finding Hamill. Meanwhile, Hamill watches the news where the parents of Lemaire's victims are being questioned. They support the doctor's immoral actions, but one parent named Diane disagrees, claiming it's pointless because, for her, Lemaire doesn't exist anymore. Hamill gets furious and tracks down Diane. He kidnaps her and brings her to the cottage. He tells her that her opinion is disgusting and cowardly. He forcefully drags Diane to Lemaire's room. He shows her that Lemaire is still existing, whether she forgets him or not. He hands her the sledgehammer to finish Lemaire and locks her inside. A few hours later, Hamill frees her, but she has not murdered Lemaire. She looks out from the cottage to know its location. She mocks Hamill, so he punches her. He drops her off at a random place and heads back. He returns to but abandons Diane's car nearby because he's too drunk to drive. He heads into Lemaire's room and starts breaking things out of frustration. Diane now informs the cops off-screen about Hamill's location. The cops locate the area and decide to search for Diane's red car. It's day 7 now, and a cop finds Diane's car. Back at the cottage, Hamill imagines seeing Jasmine's corpse. He takes her to the bathroom and bathes her. He tries to clean her blood, but it doesn't wash off, symbolizing Jasmine's permanent loss. Meanwhile, Inspector Herva Copyright arrives at the cottage. Hamill tells Lemaire that Jasmine would have been 9 years old today. He unlocks Lemaire's restraints and tries to take his life. The inspector calls him out, and Hamill walks out to surrender. The cops arrest him, and Hamill informs Herva Copyright that he didn't take Lemaire's life. A reporter asks Hamill if he regrets anything, to which he replies, "No." The movie ends here. Thank you for watching. If you're new, don't forget to subscribe for more recaps. Until next time, have a nice day.